Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ507 Ethics in Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 12, where we're going to take a look at discretion and dilemmas more specific to corrections. Before we get going, just a couple of quick slides of information. You can go here to the Prison Policy Initiative Institute website and you can look at the different numbers as it relates to incarceration, things like probation, parole, etc. And the website actually is really good because it does break things down for you. Another bit of data, if you want to take a look at it, would be a report from the U.S. Department of Justice. This is basically correctional populations in the United States in 2019, and you can see at the bottom I have a link to each one of these. The same with a really good website called Statista, and this one is very data driven. And here you can see a slide, and if you go to the website, you can pull up numbers of incarcerated individuals by corrections as a whole, by probation, by parole, by etc. And you can see here we're running from 2005 to 2019. So with that being said, a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So what do we hope to learn in this particular chapter to describe the role, the conflict issues of correctional officers? We want to be able to identify and describe some ethical issues for correctional officers, compare the challenges that face jail officers as compared to corrections officers in prison. So jails might be like a local jail or a county jail, where you might spend a year or less than a year, depending upon what your conviction is, etc. Now, as opposed to a prison where it's going to be more than a year, typically. We want to be able to explain the role conflict of treatment professionals and provide some examples, list and describe the ethical issues of probation and parole officers, and there are some, okay? All right, so with that being said, throughout this text, what we've been talking about a lot, discretion has been shown as pivotal in each phase of the criminal justice system. In corrections, discretion is involved when a correctional officer, let's say, chooses whether to write a disciplinary ticket or something similar to that, or merely give a verbal warning. The same thing a police officer might do, whether they write a traffic citation versus a warning, etc. And with that being said, discretion is also involved in punishment, which could be, increased sentence to maybe a loss of good time. But as always, when the power of discretion is present, so is the potential for its abuse. So we do have to understand that with this power, sometimes comes the potential to use it inappropriately, right? And that kind of makes sense. Now, sometimes correctional officers have the power to do things that they do not have the legal authority to do. All right. And when officers exceed their authority, that particular inmate's only recourse is to write what they call a grievance. And on the right side of the screen, you can see the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics, and corrections has one as well. So professional ethics as provided in a code of ethics is influenced by the occupational subculture and institutional values. And we've already had some chapters and discussed at length about subculture in certain careers, right? And we're talking specifically more about law enforcement, the court system, attorneys, judges, etc., and now corrections. And then, of course, the institutional values. How does the institution want all of their employees to carry out their job, etc.? So keep in mind that correctional officers, or COs as they call them, are very similar to police officers in that their uniform, okay, equals authority. So we kind of have to, understand that. So again, correctional officers are like police officers in that their uniform represents the authority of the institution, right? Uh, quite apart from any personal power of the person wearing the uniform, but that uniform itself presents authority. And some COs, as we'll discuss in a little bit, are uncomfortable with this authority and really don't know how to handle it. And other COs kind of, revel in it. They like it. And basically misperceive the bounds of authority given to them as a representative of the state. So, and this can happen to anybody when you start talking about, you're given a bunch of authority, and sometimes that could actually go to your head. So you have to really understand, the dynamic here. Now, it really is impossible to effectively depend on the authority of a uniform to get tasks accomplished, right? You must earn individuals' respect and authority from your personal reputation. And I think that's, especially in a correction setting, that's super important because your reputation is going to precede you, meaning that people are going to respect you if you follow, certain rules, etc. So, in fact, a common saying of correctional officers is that they only basically control the institution because the inmates let them. So, and that kind of makes sense, right? Because there are so many inmates in relationship to how many correctional officers might be on duty at one particular time in one particular area. So with that said, also, while not entirely true, the idea of, again, one officer per 200 inmates supports the idea that the correctional officers rule only with what we call tacit consent, meaning that authority of the uniform, if you will, and that respect factor, right? So we do have to kind of, keep in mind that this is kind of a different dynamic when you talk about corrections. So, like police officers, correctional officers have a range of coercive control over inmates, right? From, let's say, loss of liberty to even lethal force if necessary. And this power, just like with law enforcement or, the judiciary, attorneys, defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges, etc., it has the propensity or the possibility to be misused. So sensitivity to ethical issues in corrections involves recognition and respect for the inherent powers and concurrent responsibilities of that particular profession that you're working in. So, not surprisingly, COs and inmates tend to agree on a kind of a description, if you will, of what a good officer is, right? And I think there's, when you work the gang unit at a municipal department or sheriff's department or narcotics unit, and some of the criminal element might get to know you because you're stopping them and investigating, etc., you have that reputation with them as maybe being fair but firm, right? And that's a good reputation to have. Well, it's the same thing in a correctional type setting. So, here's a couple of things that they talk about. A good officer is one who treats all inmates fairly, with no favoritism, but who does not always follow the rules to the letter. So, and you're probably saying, wow, should we follow to the letter? Well, remember, discretion, right? We've talked about that before. Discretion is used judicious, or kind of sparingly, if you will. When a good officer decides to, let's say, bypass the rules, all involved tend to agree that this might be the right decision. So you have discretion not to write that violation and maybe give a warning, etc. So this is kind of what they're talking about. They're not saying violate all the rules of your general orders, etc. They're saying that maybe you don't always, not everything is black and white, is probably a better way to say that. So a good officer is not quick to use force or afraid of force if it becomes necessary. A good officer treats inmates in a professional manner and gives them the respect they deserve as human beings. And that sentence goes whether you're in corrections or not, but more so because you're always with the same individuals typically in a correctional setting. A good officer treats inmates in the way one might want to be treated. So, I mean, it's really important for, again, to have a high level of respect going in both directions. So, just to kind of finish that out, let's say if an inmate abuses the officer, that inmate will be punished, but through formal, not informal channels, right? In some cases, the officer will go far outside regular duties to aid an inmate who is maybe sincerely in need. However, he or she can detect, game playing and cannot be manipulated by some of this stuff too. So again, some of these good traits, consistency, fairness, flexibility, are confirmed as valuable aspects of what a correctional officer should exude, etc. So let's kind of look at some of the different eras, if you will. So during the rehabilitative era of the 1970s, professional staff in corrections exchanged the old label of guard for a new one, and that would be the term correctional officer. So again, this term basically replaced the old label of guard, and it kind of makes sense. It sounds a little bit better, and it also shows, correctional officer versus like prison guard. So it just has a better ring to it, if you will. Now, also in the 1970s, federal courts recognized an expanding number of prisoner rights. Things like religious beliefs, medical care, due process. These are all kind of new things that came about in the 1970s that really there weren't a lot of this before that. Okay. And, changing goals in the 1970s and 1980s created kind of a role conflict, if you will, and ambiguity for the correctional officers. And some of the other factors that kind of came along with, the differences in years, etc., came things like unionization, meaning the correctional officer union, professionalism, and diversity. So all of these different things kind of came about. So we started to see some changes to the way that things were done typically before. And now today, correctional officers probably think that inmates have, too many rights. However, the courts kind of, retreat into due difference has arguably led to the current era of penal reform. And still periodically there are abuse scandals that bring some federal lawsuits and court monitors into some state systems. And I put a little recent headline because there are things that happen. So this was from July 2nd of 2021. So there are some scandals and different things that kind of happen, right? But things are kind of changing. There's kind of this new era of correctional officers. Now, across the country, prisoners are largely out of sight and out of mind for most people. A lot of us don't sit there and think about these kinds of things, right? Unless we might have someone that we know, etc., perhaps incarcerated. And when legal rights are limited, this term now comes to light, professional ethics. This term, for us, we must step into the breach to guide what is appropriate treatment of those that are in custody. So it's important for us that, because things are out of sight, out of mind, that professional ethics is super important, especially in the corrections realm. So we have to, if we're in that realm, working as a correctional officer, etc., we have to understand that we have this professional ethic, and we have to, understand what is appropriate when it comes to treatment. Now, we call this a new era of corrections, but there was one particular case specifically in California that really started to change things here locally. So, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered California to release prisoners if they could not provide a constitutionally mandated level of medical care. So in the case of Brown versus Plata in 2011, with its 5-4 decision, indicated no strong consensus on the part of the justices. However, the court decision did indicate that there are limits to the due difference position. So in this case, again, the Supreme Court ordered that the state of California release prisoners if they could not provide a constitutionally mandated level of medical care. And really, it was just a lot of overcrowding and lack of medical care. And I have the case where you can click on the link there and go and look if you want to. So just kind of a little bit more information. California's prisons are currently designed to house approximately 85,000 inmates. And at the time of this U.S. Supreme Court case, Plata versus Brown, the California prison system housed nearly twice that many, about 156,000 inmates. So again, the Supreme Court held that California's prison system violated the inmates' Eighth Amendment rights, which we know the Eighth Amendment talks about cruel and unusual punishment. Here, more specifically, when you look at the case, we're talking about medical conditions, etc., and sleeping conditions and quarter conditions and stuff like that. So as a result of all this, the Supreme Court ordered California to release prisoners if they could not provide that mandated level of medical care. And some of the things that were pointed out, some of the deficiencies, right? Inadequate medical screening of incoming prisoners, delays in or failure to provide access to medical care, including specialist care, untimely responses to, emergencies, the interference of custodial staff with the provision of medical care, the failure to recruit and retain sufficient numbers of competent medical staff. And that's important that we put that word competent in there. There was a kind of a disorganized and incomplete medical record system, a lack of quality control procedures, a lack of protocols to deal with things like chronic illnesses, things like diabetes or heart disease or hepatitis and even HIV. And then finally, and kind of most importantly, really, would be the failure of administrative grievance, that system, to provide a timely and adequate response to complaints over medical care. So that's kind of what happened in California. Now, the state's response to this case decision was basically what we call California Assembly Bill 109 and 117, signed into law on October 1st, 2011, otherwise known as the Realignment Act. And what this did is it shifted the responsibility of corrections for nonviolent offenders to the counties. Now, you're probably thinking, well, dang, didn't that create a problem? Well, sure it did, because the counties weren't ready for it. Remember, county jails are typically those that are incarcerated for less than a year. And there are nonviolent individuals, maybe burglary suspects, that might have, a longer time in custody, right? Their sentence is longer. It might be 4 years, it could be 6 years, etc. But that took all of these individuals and shifted that down to the counties. And again, it caused individuals to be released from prison early. So there's a lot of things that happen. I'm not saying it's all bad, but trust me, it's not all good either. So there's kind of two sides to that. Now, in November of 2012, Proposition 30 passed, which kind of helped, which created permanent funding for counties to take on this greater responsibility because they didn't have enough staffing at first to deal with that. So that kind of makes sense, right? So at least the legislature kind of figured out, okay, if we're going to push all of this stuff down on the local county jails, they don't have the funding and the resources, so we should at least create some funding source for those agencies to handle that responsibility. So that at least, kind of helped a little bit. Now, California, which had been operating its prisons at 200 to 300% over capacity, was committed to reducing its prison population by 155% by 2012, which it did, and to 140% by 2016. So again, this kind of trickle down creates a lot of questions when it comes to incarceration. Who do you let out? What are the offenders that you might let out early? Do we reduce any sentences? Was it okay to move people from state prisons down to county jail facilities, etc.? So a lot of this came, as a result of, again, this Realignment Act. And it's not just happening typically in California. This type of thing is happening around the United States. And honestly, when you kind of look at it, this is kind of like a meeting room gymnasium combination, if you will, and they turned it into basically beds. And you can tell that this could be very volatile in a prison, right? So even as a former law enforcement officer, I understand that overcrowding is not a good thing. But you can't just not punish people, right? So there is a little bit of a catch-22 in there. And are there other ways to do this better, etc.? So just a couple more photos where they're like just stacking people on top of each other. So they're going like 3 deep, right? On these types of things. And this isn't the best environment for anybody, yet alone, anybody at all. So we could probably just stop there. This is not a good environment because, tempers flare. There's less control for the corrections staff or the county jail staff, etc. So it can be a little bit mind-blowing when you see some of these different pictures. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked a little bit about California and its overcrowding issues and things like that, and remember, okay, the language of the Supreme Court used really quick in that Plata decision, it really did focus on human rights. And it appeared that the justices were kind of literally shocked and even appalled at some of the conditions that were happening or occurring in California prisons. Now, while California clearly leads the country in the, multi-year effort to reduce prison populations, again, some have argued that, that type of policy shift and the responsibility of dealing with offenders to the county level, again, creates its own problems, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we do need to know that, of course, anytime there's this big shift of something to this magnitude, it's going to create some issues. Okay, so now let's move on to relationships with inmates, because again, we're still talking about discretion dilemmas in corrections. So one would assume that the general relationship between officers and inmates is one of hatred, right? You have corrections officers and you have prisoners, basically, those in custody, and you wouldn't think that there would be any type of common ground or anything there. It would be more like an us versus them. But, realistically, it's not always the case. So, it's kind of interesting when you think about it. As Martin wrote in 1993, he was a prisoner writer, if you will. He points out the posturing and vocalization from either side come from a very small number, with most inmates and officers living in kind of a uneasy state of truce, hoping that no one goes over the line, basically on kind of either side. But let's kind of just look at some different examples, if you will, on how this actually comes about, and is there some type of status quo, or can there be certain types of relationships? Well, first of all, most correctional officers and inmates prefer to live in peace and understand that they must treat each other with some respect in order to get along. And that really does make sense, right? And even though prisoners have been known to, come to the aid of officers and, let's say, physical confrontations, we've seen that in videos and stuff. In general, inmates support their fellow inmates, of course, and correctional officers are going to support their fellow officers, right? Regardless of how little support the individual deserves. So that's something for us to understand. So, they both feel that at some point, they must take sides when some type of conflict does come about. And, an officer's ethics and professionalism are seriously threatened when relationships with inmates become more personal. And here we discuss what we call the term reciprocity. And here the definition basically, here means, officers become dependent on inmates for completion of important tasks. And in return, officers may overlook little infractions, right? Little violations by the inmates. And they allow a degree of favoritism. So again, reciprocity is basically a term denoting the situation in which officers become kind of indebted a little bit to the inmates, and return favors and things like that. So you could see that this is not a really good way for any officer to operate. You don't want to be kind of stuck in the middle of this. Now, CO's involvement with inmates can occur because of the daily contact that they have, right? Combined with shared feelings of victimization by the administration. And, officers may start to think that they have more in common with some of these inmates than the administration, especially now that officers are more likely to come from urban areas, come from minority groups, and perhaps more demographically like the inmates that they supervise. Now, that's not always the case, but that has been brought to light a little bit, and it's especially true for jails. This kind of shared identity type thing, in addition to treatment by administration that seems arbitrary and unfair, might create a little bond with inmates that interfere with, the professional duties of a jail officer. Identification and friendship may lead to unethical conduct, again, such as ignoring infractions or doing little favors for the inmate that might be a violation of general orders or something like that. So these are all things that typically can happen. So again, we need to understand how this kind of works, and talk a little bit about subculture and things like that. Officers have the power to make life difficult for inmates that they don't like. If officers become personally involved, their professionalism can be compromised. An alliance sometimes forms between guards and inmates that is not unlike kind of like a foreman-employee, like I'm the supervisor-employee type thing relationship. Officers insist that you can be friendly with inmates, but you can never really trust them. And the more mature or tenured officers kind of learn to live with some of these different inconsistencies. And some of the newer ones really don't, because they haven't got into that systematic routine, if you will. Okay, so again, as we're talking about relationships, we're going to talk a little bit about sexual relationships, but I want to kind of finish this up now. Um, because prisoners are in a position of need, having to ask for things as simple as permission to go to the bathroom, officers have the power, right, to make inmates feel even more dependent than necessary, and even humiliated because of their dependency. And the relative powerlessness of officers in relation to their superiors, the administration, and society in general creates a situation where some take advantage of their only power. And what's the only power? That's the power over the inmate, right? So that kind of makes sense. So, for officers, the potential of injury or even being taken hostage is never far from their mind, and may affect, to a certain extent, their supervision of inmates, right? For, it is potentially dangerous to be disliked. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because then you're always looking over your shoulder all the time. You don't want to be disliked. You want to kind of be liked, or at least have that perception, excuse me, of being fair. And also, on a day-to-day basis, some inmates are friendly, some are funny, and some are even decent conversationalists, right? And it kind of makes you think a little bit on, they're human beings as well. And this strange combination of kind of familiarity and the fear. Okay, so you have the, being able to talk to one of these inmates, etc., but then the fear kind of results in this feeling of distrust. And officers again insist that you can be friendly with the inmates, but you can really never trust them. So these are interesting dynamics as it relates to correctional officers. So now, what about sexual relationships? Does that stuff even happen? Well, yes, it really does. And I have a couple articles, news video kind of articles on the right-hand side there. So, sexual relationships are another type of relationship between correctional officers or staff and inmates. And one of the results of the gender integration of corrections that occurred, back in the 1980s has been the rise of sexual misconduct. And it really has kind of gone up. Now, really, until the 1800s, female prisoners were housed together with men in jails with, of course, predictable results, right? And various scandals and exposés of prostitution rings led, women's reform groups pressuring legislature to build a separate institution for women in the late 1800s and early 1900s, staffed by women. Now, in the 1980s, female correctional officers began to work in the men's prisons, right? So, all things being equal, if you can have male prison guards, then why could you, or prison staff or correction officers, why could you not have female working in male, prisons? From the 1980s into the 2000s, the numbers of female corrections officers in men's prisons, if you will, has definitely increased. And as a result of that, sometimes you have this slippery slope. So, some correctional officers go down, again, this, what they call the slippery slope of developing a personal relationship with an inmate by talking about their private lives, sharing photos, perhaps talking with an inmate's family outside of the prison, etc. And in some cases, the inmate ends up using the officer to actually smuggle things in. And here you can see you had a nurse arrested here. You had prison guards arrested here. So it does happen. And it's not epidemic proportion, but, we have to understand this is part of the whole, discretion and dilemma, kind of the ethical dilemmas in corrections. So just a little bit more, and we'll kind of look at taking our first break. There was a great deal of sexual victimization occurring between female inmates. There was a surprising amount of sexual interaction between male inmates and female officers. Sexual assault is rare, but more inmates experience other forms of sexual victimization involving unwanted touching and harassment, etc. And even transgender and homosexual inmates are more likely to be victimized, as well as inmates incarcerated for sex crimes. Another vulnerable group are those that might have some mental health issues. So again, these are all things that are kind of problematic, right? And we have to understand how do we deal with some of these different things and different circumstances. Okay, so this might be an okay time to take our first break. So yeah, so let's go ahead and do that. It's just about time. We'll take our first break here, and then we'll come back and we'll start back up with part 2.